The girl had stopped breathing. Just like that. One moment she was sleeping, warm and small, and curled into her pillow the way she always slept, with one hand tucked beneath her chin like she was holding a secret. And the next moment, silence. The kind of silence that does not belong in a child's bedroom. The kind that makes the walls lean in. The kind that turns a father's blood into something cold and useless inside his veins. And the only person on earth who knew what to do, the only person who had kept that child alive for 6 years with her hands and her herbs and her prayers and her knowing, was gone. Thrown out. Slapped across the face in front of the entire household and told never to come back. By him. By the man now standing in his daughter's doorway with his phone pressed to his ear and his voice cracking open like dry wood and the sound of an ambulance that was still 40 minutes away, because that is how long it takes when you live behind walls that were built to keep the world out and you discover too late that you have also kept out the only thing that could save you. This is that story. Hello friends, welcome to our story. Before we start, please like this video, share and subscribe. Also, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Is it United States, London, maybe Canada, Jamaica, South Africa, or anywhere? We want to know. And tell us what you learned at the end of this video. Let me ask you something before we begin. Have you ever looked at a person, a quiet person, a person who moved through your life without making noise, and decided that you already knew everything about them? That their smallness was the whole of them? That because they did not demand to be seen, there was nothing worth seeing? Because that is what this man did. And what it cost him nearly destroyed everything he had left. His name was Richard Obiora. And on the morning this story begins, a Wednesday morning in the dry season, when the harmattan dust hung in the air like something unsettled and the sun came up white and hard over the rooftops of Asaba, Richard Obiora stood in the kitchen of his home and ended a woman's life with the back of his hand. Not her physical life. That would come later, in a different way, quieter and more terrible. What he ended in that kitchen was something else. Her dignity, her belonging, the thing she had built with her hands over 6 years of service in that house, the invisible architecture of care and trust and knowing that only a person who has raised someone else's child can truly understand. But we are getting ahead of the story. And this story does not want to be rushed. This story wants to be sat with. It wants to be held the way you hold something fragile, with both hands, carefully, because the breaking of it matters. So let us begin where all village stories begin. With the place. With the people. With the trouble that was already there before the stranger ever arrived. Richard Obiora was not born rich. That is important. That is the thing most people forgot about him because the money had come so fast and so large that it had swallowed everything that came before it. The way floodwater swallows a road. You forget the road was ever there. You only see the water. He grew up in Agushiaku, a small town where the red earth stuck to your feet after rain and the evenings smelled like firewood, and the women who sold Gary in the market knew your mother's name and your grandmother's name and exactly how much trouble you had caused in primary school. His father was a carpenter. Not the kind of carpenter who builds mansions. The kind who fixes doors and chairs and the wooden frames of market stalls. The kind whose hands are always rough and whose back is always tired and whose pride lives in the way a hinge swings smoothly after he has worked on it. His mother, Eunice, sold palm oil at the junction where the main road split toward Isilioku. She sat there every morning before the sun was fully up, arranging her bottles in rows on a wooden table that Richard's father had built for her. She had a way of greeting every person who walked past. Not the hurried, mechanical greeting of someone performing friendliness. The real thing. She remembered names. She remembered children's birthdays. She remembered who was sick and who was traveling and who had lost someone and needed a softer voice that day. Richard was the second of 4 children. He was quiet and watchful, and he had his mother's eyes, dark and deep and always noticing things that other people missed. He was good at school. He was good at numbers. He was good at the thing his father called seeing around corners, the ability to look at a situation and understand not just what was happening but what was about to happen, what was building underneath. He carried that gift with him out of Agushiaku, through university in Benin City, through his first job at a logistics company in Lagos where he worked 14-hour days and slept on a mattress on the floor of a room he shared with 2 other men, through the years of learning and climbing and pushing and refusing, absolutely refusing, to stay where the world had placed him. By the time he was 35, Richard Obiora owned a fleet of cargo trucks that moved goods across West Africa. By 38, he had expanded into shipping. By 41, he had built a logistics empire that operated in 4 countries, employed over 1,200 people, and generated revenue that his father, God rest him, could not have imagined if he had lived 3 lifetimes. His father did not live to see it. He died when Richard was 29, in the same small house in Aguashioku, with the same rough hands and the same tired back. A heart attack. Quick. The doctor said he probably didn't suffer. Richard never believed that. He believed that people who work that hard always suffer. They just learn to do it quietly. His mother, Eunice, lived long enough to see the money come. She visited the house in Asaba once, the big house, the house with the gate and the generator and the marble floors that Richard had built with the specific, almost desperate intention of proving that her sacrifice had not been wasted. She walked through the rooms slowly. She touched the walls. She looked at the kitchen, enormous, gleaming, full of appliances she did not recognize. And then she looked at her son and she said, in the plain, direct way she said everything. It is a fine house, Richard, but a house is not a home until it has a soul. Souls are not bought. They are cooked into the walls. They are swept into the corners. They are carried in by the people who stay. She went back to Aguashioku the next morning. She said the bed was too soft and the air smelled wrong and she missed the sound of the junction in the morning. She died 18 months later, peacefully, in her own bed, in the house her husband had built with his own hands, the house that smelled right. Richard mourned her the way men like him mourn, quietly, structurally. He paid for the funeral. He built a monument at the cemetery. He set up a scholarship in her name at the local school. He did everything that money could do, and then he went back to Lagos, back to the office, back to the trucks and the spreadsheets and the phone calls, and he sealed the grief behind a door in his mind and he did not open it again. If this story is already warming your heart, please hit the like button and subscribe to Village Heart, and drop a comment below telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love knowing our little village reaches so far. He married a woman named Adiz. She was beautiful and educated and came from a family in Onitsha whose name opened doors in rooms that Richard's name had only recently learned to enter. The marriage was built on respect and shared ambition and a kind of careful, measured affection that Richard mistook for love because he had never learned what love actually looked like between 2 adults. His parents had loved each other, truly loved each other, but they had done it in a language that Richard did not speak. They had done it in acts, in gestures, in the cup of water placed silently on the table before it was asked for. Richard's love language was provision. He provided. He provided magnificently, and he believed that this was enough. Adiz gave him a daughter. They named her Chidinma. It means God is good. And when Richard held that child for the first time, something happened in his chest that he had no preparation for. A door that he thought he had sealed shut. The door with his mother's voice behind it and his father's rough hands and the smell of palm oil at the junction. That door opened. Just a crack. Just enough for something warm and terrifying to slip through. He loved that child. He loved her in a way that frightened him because it was the one thing in his life that he could not control, could not manage, could not optimize with systems and schedules and the sheer force of his will. Chidinma did not care about his empire. She cared about whether he would sit on the floor with her and build towers out of wooden blocks. She cared about whether he would read the story with the funny voices or the boring way. She cared about whether his hand was there when she reached for it in the dark. And here is the thing about Chidinma that changed everything, the thing that sat at the center of this story like a stone at the bottom of a river, shaping the current around it without anyone fully seeing it. Chidinma was sick. Not visibly. Not in a way that strangers would notice. She was a bright child, alert and curious, with her grandmother Eunice's deep dark eyes and her father's way of watching things carefully before responding. She laughed easily. She talked to everyone, the guards, the gardeners, the woman who sold groundnuts at the gate. She had a gift for people. She collected them the way other children collected shells or stones, gathering them close, remembering their names, asking questions that adults found startling in their directness. But she had been born with a condition. a respiratory condition that the doctors in Lagos had explained to Richard in language so technical and so specific that he had written every word down in a notebook and then gone home and researched it for 3 days straight without sleeping. What it meant, stripped of its medical terminology, was this. Chidinma's lungs did not work the way other children's lungs worked. They were fragile, sensitive, reactive to things that other lungs handled without complaint: dust, cold air, certain foods, stress, sudden changes in environment. On most days, this meant nothing. She ran and played and shouted and did everything a 6-year-old was supposed to do. But on some days, the bad days, her breathing would change. It would become shallow and tight, and her chest would pull inward with each breath, and the sound of it, that thin whistling sound, would fill whatever room she was in with a kind of fear that no amount of money could answer. Richard had done what Richard always did. He had thrown resources at it. The best pediatric pulmonologist in Lagos, a specialist in Abuja, a consultation with a doctor in London via video call, medications, inhalers, nebulizers, air purifiers in every room. He had rebuilt the ventilation system of the entire house. He had installed monitors that tracked air quality in real time. He had created a medical response protocol that was printed, laminated, and posted on the wall of every staff room in the household. He had built a fortress of care around his daughter. And inside that fortress, with her hands and her knowledge and her quiet, patient, unhurried presence, was a woman named Mama Ngozi. Nobody called her by her real name. Even Richard, who prided himself on precision in all things, had stopped trying to remember the name on her employment contract. She was Mama Ngozi to everyone. She had been Mama Ngozi for so long that the name had become less a name and more a description. The way you might say the river or the market or the evening. Something that was simply there. Something you stopped noticing because it had always been present. She was somewhere between 60 and 70 years old. She did not know her exact age, or if she did not share it. She was from a village outside Agbor, a place so small that it appeared on no maps and was known only to the people who lived there and the people who had left it. She was short and broad, and her hands were wide and rough and moved with the kind of certainty that belongs to people who have spent their entire lives making things, food, medicine, comfort, solutions, with whatever was available. She had come to the house 6 years ago, the same month Chidinma was born. Not as a cook originally. She had been hired as a kitchen assistant, the lowest position in the household, the person who washed pots and peeled yams and carried bags of rice from the storeroom and was expected to do all of it silently, invisibly, the way the building's plumbing was expected to work without anyone thinking about it. But Mama Ngozi was not a woman who stayed in the position she was placed in. Not because she was ambitious, not because she was political, but because she had something that no job description could contain. She had knowledge. She knew food the way a musician knows sound. Not from training, not from cookbooks, not from the culinary programs that the head cook, a sharp-tongued woman named Beatrice, had attended in Accra. Mama Ngozi knew food from her hands, from her mother, from her grandmother, from 60 years of living close to the earth in a place where the nearest doctor was a day's walk and the nearest pharmacy did not exist. She knew which leaves brought down a fever. She knew which roots settled a stomach. She knew that the bark of a certain tree, stripped thin and boiled slowly with honey, could open the chest of a child who was struggling to breathe. She knew that palm kernel oil, warmed gently and mixed with a specific combination of herbs that grew wild along the riverbank near her village, could be rubbed into the chest of a wheezing child, and within minutes, the breathing would ease. The whistling would quiet. The child's face would relax from a mask of fear into something peaceful. She knew these things the way she knew her own hands. Completely. Without doubt. Without hesitation. The first time she used this knowledge in Richard's house, Chidinma was 11 months old. It was a Thursday night. The harmattan had come early that year, and the air was dry and full of dust, and Chidinma had been coughing since afternoon. By evening, the coughing had changed. It had become that sound, that tight, whistling, chest-pulling sound that Richard had learned to fear more than anything in his life. The nebulizer was set up. The medication was administered. The protocol was followed. Every step, every measurement, every timed interval. And it was not working. Chidinma's breathing was getting worse. Her small fingers were gripping the edge of her crib. Her eyes were wide and frightened, and she was looking at the adults around her with an expression that no parent should ever have to see on their child's face. The expression of a child who is asking for help and can see that the help is not coming. Richard was on the phone with the specialist in Lagos. The specialist was saying words. Calm words. Measured words. Words about adjusting dosage and monitoring oxygen levels, and if things don't improve in the next 30 minutes, take her to the hospital. The hospital was 45 minutes away. And in the kitchen, hearing the commotion through the walls the way she heard everything in that house, Mama Ngozi put down the pot she was scrubbing. She dried her hands on her wrapper. She walked without hurry but without hesitation down the corridor to the nursery. She did not knock. She simply appeared in the doorway. Small, broad, calm, with her wide hands and her steady eyes and the smell of the kitchen still on her clothes. The nurse on duty, a young woman named Blessing, looked up at her with an expression that was half confusion and half relief. The specific expression of a person who has run out of their own answers and is ready to accept help from any direction. Mama Ngozi walked to the crib. She looked at Chidinma. She placed one hand, gently, on the child's chest. She felt the breathing, the tightness, the labor of those small lungs fighting against air that had become their enemy. And then she turned to Blessing and she said, in a voice that was as steady as stone, "Bring me warm water, a small towel, and do not touch the child for 5 minutes. Let me work." What she did in the next 5 minutes, Richard would later learn from Blessing because he was still on the phone with the specialist and did not see it himself, was this. She produced from somewhere on her person, from a pocket, from a fold in her wrapper, a small tin. Inside the tin was a paste. Dark, thick, smelling of something earthy and sharp and green. She warmed it between her palms. She opened Chidinma's sleeping gown, and she rubbed the paste into the child's chest with slow, firm, circular motions, humming as she worked. Not a song, not a melody, a sound. Low and steady and rhythmic, the kind of sound that vibrates in the bones. Chidinma stopped crying. Her eyes, wide and wet, focused on Mama Ngozi's face. Her small hand reached up and grabbed one of Mama Ngozi's thick fingers and held on. And within 4 minutes, the breathing changed. The whistling faded. The chest stopped pulling. The oxygen monitor, which Blessing had been watching with the specific intensity of a woman who was preparing to call an ambulance, began to climb. Steadily, quietly, the way a tide comes in. By the time Richard finished his call with the specialist and walked into the nursery, Chidinma was asleep. Her breathing was even. Her face was peaceful. And Mama Ngozi was standing by the crib with one hand resting on the child's back, watching her breathe the way a gardener watches rain fall on dry soil. Richard looked at the oxygen monitor. He looked at his daughter. He looked at the old woman standing beside the crib in her kitchen clothes with the smell of palm oil and something green and earthy clinging to her like a second skin. He did not say thank you. He did not ask what she had done. He did not ask where the paste had come from or what was in it or how a kitchen assistant with no medical training had just done what his specialist, his nebulizer, and his protocol had failed to do. He said, "You can go back to the kitchen now." And Mama Ngozi looked at him with an expression that he did not understand then and would not understand for a very long time. An expression that was not angry, not hurt, not surprised, just knowing. The expression of a woman who had seen enough of the world to know exactly what kind of man was standing in front of her and who had decided, long ago, that the kind of man someone was mattered less than the kind of child they were raising. She went back to the kitchen. And that night, that first night, became the pattern. Not a pattern that anyone planned or documented or added to the laminated protocol on the staff room wall. An invisible pattern. An understanding that lived in the spaces between the official systems. When the medicines worked, the medicines worked. When the nebulizer was enough, the nebulizer was enough. But on the bad nights, the really bad nights, when Chidinma's body decided to fight itself and the modern interventions stumbled and the monitors beeped their thin, frightened warnings, someone would go to the kitchen. And Mama Ngozi would come. She always came. 2 in the morning. 3. 4. It did not matter. She came with her tin and her hands and her humming, and she knelt beside that child, and she worked until the breathing eased and the fear left and the room could exhale. 6 years. She did this for 6 years. And in those 6 years, she became something in that house that had no title, no job description, no line item in the household budget. She became the thing that Richard's mother had once talked about. The soul of the house. The warmth that is cooked into the walls. The thing that money cannot buy and systems cannot replicate and power cannot command into existence. Chidinma called her Mama Ngozi the way other children say mama. Not as a title, as a fact, as the word for the person who is always there. The person whose lap is always available. The person who knows what to do when the world becomes frightening and the air becomes thin and the adults with their phones and their specialists and their protocols are standing around looking helpless. Mama Ngozi braided Chidinma's hair every Sunday morning. She told her stories about the tortoise and the spider and the girl who could talk to rivers. She taught her how to wash rice properly, with her fingers spread wide, feeling for the stones. She taught her the names of plants in a language that Chidinma's expensive school did not teach. She called her NWM, my child, and Chidinma called her Mama. And between the two of them existed a bond that every person in that household could see and that Richard Obiora had somehow, impossibly, never fully understood. Because Richard saw Mama Ngozi the way he saw the generator. Essential but mechanical. Necessary but replaceable. Something that served a function and could be maintained through proper management and, if it broke down, swapped out for a newer model. He did not see the woman. He saw the role. And that blindness, that specific, practiced, expensive blindness, is the thing that brought him to this Wednesday morning in the dry season. Standing in his kitchen with dust in the air and heat pressing against the windows and his hands still stinging from the contact it had just made with an old woman's face. It began with the fish. Richard was hosting a dinner that evening. Not a family dinner. A business dinner. The kind of dinner where the napkins are folded into shapes and the wine costs more than most people earn in a month and the conversation is not really conversation but negotiation disguised as warmth. 3 investors from Abuja were coming to discuss an expansion deal worth $30 million. Richard had been preparing for this meeting for weeks. Every detail had been planned. The menu had been approved by Richard personally, dish by dish, ingredient by ingredient. The fish was to be grilled sea bass. Imported, specific, delivered that morning by a supplier Richard had used for events like this before. At 11 a.m. Beatrice, the head cook, came to Richard's study. Her face told him everything before her mouth opened. "The fish has turned," she said. Richard looked up from his laptop. "What do you mean, turned?" "It's off, sir. The delivery this morning, something went wrong with the cold chain. The fish is not usable." Richard felt the back of his neck tighten. "Replace it. The supplier says they can't get another batch until tomorrow morning." I called 2 others. "Same problem. It's the season, sir. The boats haven't been landing well this week." Richard stood up. "I have 3 investors coming to this house tonight. The menu has been sent to them. Sea bass is on that menu. Find me the fish." Beatrice nodded quickly and left. She spent the next 2 hours on the phone. She sent a driver to the market. She called contacts in Benin City and Warri. At 1 p.m. she came back to Richard's study with the same face. "I can't find the fish, sir. Not at the quality we need. Not by tonight." Richard pressed both palms flat on his desk. He breathed in through his nose. He was a man who solved problems. Problems were what he did. He had built an empire on the ability to look at a problem and find the solution that no one else could see. But this problem had a deadline, and the deadline was 7 p.m. And the clock was moving, and his investors were already on a flight, and everything about this evening had to be perfect because perfection was the language Richard spoke when he wanted to say, "Trust me with your money." And that was when Mama Ngozi appeared in the doorway of his study. She did not knock. She never knocked. This was one of the things about Mama Ngozi that had irritated Richard for years without him ever saying it out loud. The woman moved through the house as if it were hers. As if the doors existed not to separate spaces but to connect them. As if she had a right to appear wherever she was needed, and she always seemed to know where she was needed before anyone called for her. She stood in the doorway, short and broad in her kitchen clothes, and she said, "I heard about the fish." Richard did not look up. "It's being handled." "It is not being handled," Mama Ngozi said, in the same calm, matter-of-fact tone she used for everything. "Beatrice cannot find what doesn't exist. The boats have not been landing. The fish is not coming." Richard looked up now. There was an edge in his jaw. "But I can make something better," Mama Ngozi said. She stepped into the room without being invited. She stood in front of his desk and she looked at him with those steady, unhurried eyes. "My grandmother taught me a way to prepare catfish that I have never made for anyone outside my family. It is slow-cooked in a sauce made from uziza leaves and yuta and ihuru and a smoking method that takes 4 hours. The fish falls apart on the tongue. It is the kind of food that makes a person stop talking and close their eyes." She paused. "Your guests will not miss the sea base. They will forget they ever wanted it." Richard stared at her. For a long moment he simply stared. And then he said, in a voice so flat and so final that the air in the room seemed to contract, "I did not ask for your opinion." Mama Ngozi did not flinch. She rarely flinched. This was another thing about her that Richard found difficult. The way she stood in the face of his authority like a tree stands in wind. Not defiant. Not provocative. Simply rooted. "You asked Beatrice for a solution," Mama Ngozi said. "I am giving you one." "You are a kitchen assistant," Richard said. His voice had dropped lower now. The dangerous register. The one that made his employees go quiet and his competitors go careful. "You peel yams. You wash pots. You do not walk into my study and tell me what to serve at my table." "I am telling you what will work," Mama Ngozi said simply. And something in the simplicity of it, something in the way she stood there, immovable, unhurried, refusing to shrink in his presence, something in the way she looked at him as if his money and his power and his empire were interesting but ultimately beside the point. Something in all of that touched the wire inside Richard that was always live, always hot, always waiting for someone to brush against it. He stood up from his desk. He walked around it. He stood in front of Mama Ngozi. He was a tall man. She was a short woman. He looked down at her and she looked up at him, and in the space between them was every unspoken thing that had lived in that house for 6 years. Every time she had saved his daughter's breathing without being thanked. Every time she had cooked meals that were not on the menu and been told to stay in her lane. Every time she had loved his child with a depth and a constancy that he had registered only as a function, a service, a line item. "Get out of my study," he said. Mama Ngozi did not move. "Get out," he said again, louder. She looked at him, and then she said the thing that ended everything. The sentence that broke the last thread of Richard Obiora's patience and sent his hand across her face before his mind could catch up with his body. She said, quietly, without malice, without anger, with nothing in her voice but the plain truth of a woman who had been watching him for 6 years. "Your mother would not recognize the man you have become." The sound of the slap was sharp and flat and final. It echoed off the walls of the study, off the imported marble floor, off the framed photographs and the awards and the evidence of a life that was built to impress people who would never see what happened behind the doors. Mama Ngozi's head turned with the blow. Her hand went to her cheek. She did not cry out. She did not fall. She stood and she absorbed it the way she absorbed everything, with a stillness that was not weakness but something older and stronger and more terrifying than any display of power Richard Obiora had ever produced. The room went very quiet. Richard's hand was still raised. His breath was ragged. And somewhere behind his eyes, in the place where the door to his mother's memory lived, something had cracked open, and the sound that came from behind it was not anger. It was recognition. The horrible, immediate, unavoidable recognition of a man who has just done the thing he swore he would never do. But the recognition came too late, because the words were already coming out of his mouth. The words that pride and shame and fury were pushing past his teeth before wisdom could stop them. "Pack your things," he said. His voice was shaking. "You are finished in this house. Get out. Now. Tonight. I don't want to see your face again." Mama Ngozi lowered her hand from her cheek. She looked at him one more time, and in her eyes was something that Richard would see every time he closed his own eyes for the rest of his life. Not hatred, not accusation, Sorrow. The specific, heavy, ancient sorrow of a woman who had known this was coming, who had watched it build for 6 years, who had stayed anyway, for the child, always for the child, and who understood now, standing in this study with the print of his hand warming on her face, that staying had finally cost her everything. She turned. She walked out. She did not pack her things because her things were few and small and they fit in the same bag she had arrived with 6 years ago. A change of clothes, a Bible with a cracked spine, the small tin with the paste inside it, the paste that had saved Chidinma's breathing more times than anyone had counted, a photograph of a child she had lost long ago, tucked inside the Bible's front cover, creased and faded and held together with tape. She walked out of the house through the kitchen, past Beatrice who stood frozen by the stove with her hand over her mouth, past the young house girl who pressed herself against the wall, past the gardener who was coming in from the compound and who stopped in the doorway when he saw her face. The mark on it, the redness, the thing that everyone in that house would know about within the hour and that nobody, not one of them, would have the courage to speak about to Richard's face. She walked through the gate. The security guard, a man named Solomon who had shared his lunch with Mama Ngozi every afternoon for 4 years, opened the small pedestrian gate without being asked. He looked at her face. He looked at the ground. He said nothing because what could he say? What words exist for this? Mama Ngozi stepped through the gate and onto the road. The harmattan dust was thick in the air. The sun was white and hard and the road stretched out in both directions, empty and long, the way roads look when you have nowhere to go. She turned left. She began to walk. And behind her, in the house she had just left, in the room on the second floor where the curtains were drawn and the air purifier hummed its steady mechanical hum and the monitors blinked their green lights in the artificial twilight, a 6-year-old girl slept peacefully in her bed. Her breathing was even. Her face was calm, one hand tucked beneath her chin. She did not know that Mama Ngozi was gone. She did not know that the person who had been the center of her small world for every day of her life had just walked out through the gate with a bruise forming on her cheek and a bag that contained everything she owned. She did not know any of this yet, but her body knew something. Bodies know. Children's bodies especially. They are tuned to frequencies that adults have learned to ignore. They feel the absence of safety before the mind has words for it. They feel the shift in the air when love leaves a room. Even a sleeping child. Even a child whose eyes are closed and whose mind is somewhere in the peaceful country of dreams. And so, 7 hours later at 11:47 p.m. in the deep darkness of a house that had hosted a dinner party where the wine had been expensive and the conversation had been careful and the fish, in the end, had been a second-choice substitute that Richard had barely tasted because something was sitting on his chest that no amount of imported wine could wash away. At 11:47 p.m., Chidinma's breathing changed. It did not change slowly. It did not give warning. It changed the way a light goes out. One moment there, the next moment gone. The monitor beside her bed began to scream. And Richard Obiora, who had spent his entire life building systems to prevent exactly this moment, who had thrown millions at doctors and machines and protocols and medications, ran down the corridor of his own house toward his daughter's room and arrived in the doorway to find the night nurse already there, already working, already doing everything the protocol said to do. And none of it was working. The nebulizer was on. The medication was administered. The emergency oxygen was flowing. Every step was followed. Every measurement was correct. Every timed interval was observed. And Chidinma's lips were turning blue. And in that moment, in that specific, terrible, unforgettable moment, Richard Obiora looked around the room for the one person who always knew what to do. The one person whose hands could reach his daughter where machines could not. The one person who had stood by that crib, by that bed, for 6 years, with her tin and her paste and her humming, and had never, not once, not ever failed to bring Chidinma's breathing back. He looked for Mama Ngozi, and she was not there, because he had slapped her across the face and thrown her out of his house and told her never to come back. And she had gone. And she had taken with her the tin and the paste and the knowledge and the knowing and the 6 years of love that had been the only thing standing between his daughter and this exact moment. And Richard Obiora, standing in the doorway of his daughter's bedroom, watching his child's lips turn blue while machines beeped their useless warnings, understood with a clarity so sharp it drew blood inside his chest that he had not just lost his temper that morning in his study. He had thrown away his daughter's life. The night nurse's name was Amara. She was 26 years old, and she had been trained at the best nursing school in Enugu, and she had graduated at the top of her class, and she had never, in her 3 years of working in pediatric care, seen a child's oxygen levels fall this fast while every intervention was already in place. She was doing everything right. That was the thing that would stay with her for years. She was doing everything right, and it was not enough. The nebulizer was running. The emergency inhaler had been administered twice at the approved intervals. The oxygen mask was fitted. The child's position was adjusted exactly the way the protocol described: elevated, supported, airway clear. And still the numbers on the monitor were falling. 92, 89, 86. Each number lower than the last. Each number a step further from safety. Each number a door closing. Chidinma's small body was working so hard. That was what Richard could not stop looking at. The effort. The terrible, visible, whole-body effort of a child trying to breathe. Her chest pulling inward with each inhale. Her nostrils flaring. Her fingers gripping the bedsheet with a strength that seemed impossible for hands that small. Her eyes were open now, wide and wet, and looking directly at her father with an expression that dismantled every wall he had ever built. She was looking at him the way his mother had once described children looking at their parents during the war. Not with words, with everything. The whole of their trust and their fear gathered into one look that said, "You are supposed to fix this. You are the one who makes it stop. Why is it not stopping?" Richard crossed the room in 2 steps. He was beside the bed. His hand was on his daughter's hand. His other hand was pressing his phone to his ear. The specialist in Lagos, the one he paid a retainer to be available at any hour, was answering on the 3rd ring. "Her oxygen is at 84, Richard said. His voice was a thing he did not recognize. It belonged to someone else. Someone smaller and more frightened than the man who ran an empire. "The nebulizer is not working. The emergency protocol is not working. Nothing is working." The specialist, a calm, experienced man named Dr. Fashanu, asked questions. Specific questions. Richard answered them. Amara answered them. The information moved back and forth across the phone line like cargo being loaded onto a truck that was already on fire. "You need to get her to a hospital," Dr. Fashanu said. His voice had changed. The professional calm was still there, but underneath it was something tighter. Something that Richard recognized because he had heard it in his own voice a moment ago. Urgency. Real urgency. "The nearest facility with a pediatric ICU is 45 minutes, Richard said. Silence on the line. The kind of silence that contains a calculation that the person making it does not want to share. "Then you need to go now," Dr. Fashanu said. "Right now. Do not wait for an ambulance. Take your own car. Keep the oxygen flowing. Keep her upright. And Richard." Pause. "Drive fast." Richard hung up. He looked at Amara. "We're moving her." Amara nodded. She was already gathering the portable oxygen unit, the emergency bag, the medications. Her hands were steady. Her face was not. There were tears on her cheeks that she had not stopped to wipe because stopping to wipe tears was not in the protocol, and Amara was a woman who followed protocols because protocols were the thing between you and chaos. Richard lifted his daughter from the bed. She was so light. That was the thought that went through him as he picked her up. A thought so ordinary and so devastating that it nearly buckled his knees. She was so light. She weighed almost nothing. This child who was his entire world, who was the reason the world made sense, who was the only door he had left open after his mother died and his father died and his grief had been sealed behind walls so thick he had forgotten they were there. This child weighed almost nothing in his arms. He carried her down the corridor. The house was awake now. Lights coming on in every room. Staff appearing in doorways in their nightclothes. Faces blank with sleep and then sharp with fear as they saw what was happening. Beatrice was in the kitchen doorway. Solomon was at the front door already opening it wide. And every single one of them, every face in that hallway, every pair of eyes that watched Richard carry his daughter toward the car, was thinking the same thing. The same name. The same question. Where is Mama Ngozi? Nobody said it. Nobody dared. But it was there, in the air between them, as real as the dust. As real as the child's labored breathing. As real as the mark that was still visible on the space where an old woman's face had been struck that morning in a study full of awards. Richard got into the back seat of the car. Amara climbed in beside him. She held the oxygen unit. Richard held Chidinma. The driver, a man named Emeka who had been with the household for 8 years and who had driven through floods and roadblocks in situations that would have stopped lesser men, put the car in gear and moved. They drove fast. Through the compound gates. Through the quiet streets of the estate. Through the main road where the streetlights were spaced too far apart and the darkness between them felt enormous. The car moved through the night the way a ship moves through a storm, with purpose and speed and the kind of reckless precision that belongs to people who are racing something they cannot see. In the back seat, Richard held his daughter. Her head was against his chest. The oxygen mask covered her small face. Her breathing was thin and shallow, and each breath sounded like it cost her something she could not afford. Richard looked down at her face in the intermittent light of the street lamps. Light, dark, light, dark. Her face appearing and disappearing. Her eyes were closed now. Not sleeping. Something else. Something further away than sleep. Chidinma, he said softly. NWAM. Stay with me. NWAM. My child. The same words Mama Ngozi used. The same words coming from his mouth, tasting different. Tasting borrowed. Because he had heard those words 1,000 times in this old woman's voice, and he had never once understood what they actually meant. He had heard them as a function, as a role being performed, as the sound a hired woman makes when she is doing the job she is paid to do. He had never heard them as love. Until now. Until this moment in the back of a car in the dark with his daughter's breathing getting thinner and the hospital getting closer but not close enough and the absence of Mama Ngozi filling every corner of the vehicle like cold water rising. He had never understood until now that when Mama Ngozi said NWAM to his daughter, she was not performing. She was not functioning. She was loving. The way his own mother had loved. The way his mother had stood at that junction every morning and greeted every person by name. The way love looks when it does not come from money or power or position but from the simple, ancient, irreplaceable decision to care about another human being more than you care about yourself. 81. Amara said the number quietly, reading the portable monitor. Her voice was professional but her eyes were watching Richard's face. Richard closed his own eyes. He pressed his cheek against the top of his daughter's head. And in the darkness behind his eyelids he saw it. Not a memory. A vision. Clear as daylight, sharp as glass. Mama Ngozi kneeling beside Chidinma's crib. Her wide hands warm with the paste from her tin. Her voice humming that low, steady sound that was not a melody but something older than melody. Something that belonged to the earth itself. To the village outside Agbor. To the grandmother who taught her. To the generations of women who had stood between children and death with nothing but their hands and their knowledge and the fierce, quiet, unmovable conviction that this child will live because I am here and I will not leave. That was what he had thrown out. Not a cook. Not a kitchen assistant. Not a servant who had overstepped her station. A healer. A mother. The living memory of a kind of knowledge that no hospital and no specialist and no amount of money could replace. And he had slapped her face. The car hit a pothole. Chidinma's body jerked. She made a sound. Not a cry. Something smaller. A whimper. The sound a child makes when they have used up their energy for crying and have nothing left but this thin, exhausted signal that they are still here, still fighting, still hoping that someone will make it stop. Richard held her tighter. He looked at Amara. Amara looked at the monitor. She did not say the number this time. She did not need to. Her face said it. Faster, Richard said to Emeka. Emeka drove faster. They reached the hospital at 12 minutes past midnight. It was not the kind of hospital that Richard was accustomed to. It was a government hospital, the nearest one with a pediatric emergency unit, and it looked the way government hospitals look at midnight. Fluorescent lights, crowded corridors, the smell of disinfectant fighting a losing battle against the smell of human crisis. People everywhere, sitting on benches, standing against walls. lying on stretchers in hallways because the rooms were full. Richard carried Chidinma through the entrance and the triage nurse took one look at the child's color and the portable oxygen unit and moved without hesitation. Within 3 minutes, Chidinma was in a treatment bay. Within 5, a doctor was there. A young woman, exhausted, sharp-eyed, already moving with the controlled speed of someone who has seen too many children come through these doors too late. She examined Chidinma. She read the vitals Amara had been tracking. She listened to the chest with her stethoscope and her face did something that Richard watched very carefully because he was a man who read faces and what he read on hers in that moment made the floor feel unsteady beneath his feet. "She's in severe bronchospasm," the doctor said. "We're going to start 4 bronchodilators and systemic corticosteroids. I want continuous monitoring and a chest x-ray within the hour." She looked at Richard. "Has she had episodes this severe before?" "Yes," Richard said. "But they were always managed. At home. There was a—" He stopped. The doctor waited. "There was a treatment," Richard said slowly. "A traditional preparation. Topical. Applied to the chest. It always worked. It worked when nothing else did." The doctor's expression shifted. Not dismissal. Something more complicated. "Do you have it with you?" "No." "Do you know what was in it?" "No." "Who prepared it?" Richard's jaw tightened. "A woman who worked in my house. She's gone." The doctor looked at him for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then she turned back to Chidinma and began working. Richard stood in the corner of that treatment bay. He stood the way he had stood in boardrooms and negotiations and crisis meetings, still, controlled, watching everything, processing everything. But for the first time in his adult life, the processing was not producing solutions. The machine in his mind that turned problems into answers was running and returning nothing. Because the answer was not in this hospital. The answer was not on a screen or in a vial or in a protocol. The answer was walking along a road somewhere in the darkness outside Asaba with a bruise on her face and a tin in her bag and nowhere to go. At 2 o'clock in the morning, the 4 medications began to take effect. Chidinma's oxygen levels stabilized. Not improved. Stabilized. The doctor used that word carefully, and Richard understood the careful way she used it. Stabilized meant the bleeding had stopped. It did not mean the wound was healed. It meant they had bought time. It did not mean they had bought enough. "The next 12 hours are critical," the doctor said. "If she responds well to the treatment, we'll see improvement by morning. If she doesn't—" She paused. "We'll reassess. We'll reassess." 2 words that meant everything and nothing. 2 words that contained the possibility of a world Richard could not allow himself to imagine. He sat beside his daughter's bed. The hospital sounds surrounded him. The beeping of monitors. The murmur of nurses. The distant cry of another child somewhere in the ward. The specific, relentless, humbling soundtrack of a place where money cannot buy you a different outcome. Where you sit in the same plastic chair as everyone else and wait with the same fear. At 3 o'clock in the morning, Chidinma opened her eyes. She looked at Richard. Her face was pale beneath the oxygen mask. Her eyes were heavy with exhaustion and medication. But she was looking at him. She was seeing him. She was here. "Papa," she whispered. The word was muffled by the mask, but Richard heard it the way you hear your own heartbeat. Not with your ears. With your whole body. "I'm here, NWAM." His voice cracked. He held her hand. Her small fingers were cold in his. "Where is Mama Ngozi?" she asked. For words. The same 4 words his mother had once spoken to him in a different context. A lifetime ago. "What did you do?" For words that cut through every defense, every wall, every carefully constructed version of himself that Richard had spent decades building. He could not answer. He opened his mouth and nothing came out because the truth was too terrible and the lie was too heavy and in the space between them was nothing. Just silence and the beeping of machines and a child's question that he could not answer. "She'll come," he said finally. "She'll come, Chidinma. Promise." Chidinma looked at him for a long moment. Then her eyes closed. And Richard sat in that plastic chair and he made a promise that he did not know how to keep. But he was going to keep it. At 5 o'clock in the morning, With the first gray light of dawn beginning to press against the hospital windows, Richard stepped into the corridor. He took out his phone. He called Solomon, the security guard. "I need you to find someone," he said. "Sir, Mama Ngozi. I need to know where she went. Ask the other guards. Ask the compound staff. Ask the woman who sells groundnuts at the gate. Someone saw which direction she went. Someone knows something." Solomon was quiet for a moment. Then he said carefully, "I will ask, sir." Richard called his head of operations next. A man named Felix who managed the household systems with the kind of efficiency that Richard demanded from everyone in his life. "I need you to locate a woman," Richard said. He gave Mama Ngozi's name. Her real name, the one on the employment contract that he had never bothered to memorize. He had to check the household records to find it. Took Felix 4 minutes. Her name was Ngozi Okafor. Find her phone number. Call it. If she doesn't answer, find her last known address. The address she gave when she was hired 6 years ago. The village outside Agbor. "Sir," Felix said. And there was something in his voice that Richard had never heard before from this man. Hesitation. "Sir, is everything all right?" "No," Richard said. "Nothing is all right. Find her." He hung up. He stood in the corridor of that government hospital at 5 o'clock in the morning with his suit from the dinner party still on. Wrinkled now and stained with something he couldn't identify, and he pressed his back against the wall and he closed his eyes and he waited. If this story has found its way into your heart, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new tale from Village Heart. Your support is what keeps the fire burning, and more stories like this one coming your way. The call from Solomon came at 7:30 in the morning. "I spoke to Mama Ataku, the groundnut seller at the gate," Solomon said. "She said she saw Mama Ngozi leave the compound yesterday afternoon. She walked toward the main road. Mama Ataku offered to call an Okada for her. Mama Ngozi refused. She said she would walk." "Walk where?" Mama Ataku asked her the same question. She said Mama Ngozi looked at her and said, "Home." Just that one word. Home. Home. The village outside Agbor. Over 3 hours by car. On foot, in the heat, for a woman between 60 and 70 years old, carrying everything she owned in a single bag, with a bruise on her face and whatever was inside her heart after what had happened in that study. Richard felt something move through him that was not quite nausea and not quite grief but something in between. Something that tasted like the specific shame of a man who is only now understanding the full weight of what he has done. "Get the car ready," Richard said. "Not the main car. The small one. I'm going myself." "Sir, Chidinma. Amara is with her. The doctor is monitoring. She's stable." The word felt different now. Heavier. Less reliable. "I'll be back before evening. But I need to go. Now." He drove himself. He had not driven himself in years. The roads outside Asaba narrowed quickly from tarmac to laterite to dirt. The harmattan dust was thick in the morning air, coating the windscreen in a fine red film that the wipers smeared into a haze. The landscape changed as he drove. From the concrete and fences of the city to something older. Something quieter. Farmland. Bush. Small villages set back from the road where children walked to school in uniforms that were washed so many times the color was just a memory. He drove with both hands on the wheel and his eyes on the road and his mind split between two places. The hospital bed where his daughter lay. And the road ahead, where an old woman was walking toward a village that most people had never heard of. He stopped 3 times to ask for directions. The first person, a young man selling fuel from jerry cans at the roadside, did not know the village. The second, an older woman carrying firewood on her head, knew the name but was not sure of the road. The third, an elderly man sitting outside a small shop in a town called Igbank, looked at Richard for a long time, then pointed down a narrow track that disappeared into the bush. "That way," the old man said. "But the road is bad. You will need to walk the last part." Richard drove until the track became impossible. Then he parked the car under a tree and he got out and he walked. The path was narrow and the bush pressed in close on both sides. The morning heat was already building, and the air was heavy with the smell of damp earth and green things growing and the sound of insects and distant birds. Richard walked in his city shoes on a village path, and the red earth stained his shoes and the thorns caught at his trousers, and he did not stop. He walked for 20 minutes. And then the path opened into a clearing and he saw it. The village was small, very small. A collection of houses made of mud and zinc roofing, arranged around a central clearing where a large tree stood. Its branches spread wide like arms, offering shade to everything beneath it. There was a well near the tree. There were chickens moving through the clearing with the purposeful, unhurried walk that chickens have when they are in a place they have always known. There were people. An old man sitting on a bench outside one of the houses. 2 women walking together, one carrying a basin on her head. Children, 3 of them, chasing each other around the tree with the pure, unreasonable joy that children produce when they have nothing but space and each other in mourning. Richard stood at the edge of the clearing. He did not know what to do with his body. He was a man who always knew what to do with his body. He knew how to enter boardrooms. He knew how to stand at the head of tables. He knew how to fill a space with his presence so completely that people forgot there had ever been air in the room before he arrived. But he did not know how to enter this village. He did not know how to stand in this clearing. He did not know how to be the man he was in a place like this, because the man he was had been built for a different world, and that man was no use here. The old man on the bench saw him first. He looked at Richard with an expression that was not hostile but was not welcoming either. The expression of a man who has seen many people come from the city and has learned that most of them bring nothing worth having. Richard walked toward him. His city shoes crunched on the packed earth. The sound was wrong. Everything about him was wrong in this place. "Good morning, sir," Richard said. "I am looking for a woman named Ngozi Okafor." The old man looked at him for a long time. Then he looked at Richard's shoes. Then at his car, visible through the trees at the edge of the clearing. Then back at Richard's face. "Why?" the old man said. It was not a complicated question. But it stopped Richard completely. Because the honest answer, the real answer, was so tangled and so heavy and so full of things, he did not know how to say out loud that he stood there in the clearing of that village with the chickens and the children and the morning sun, and he could not speak. The old man watched him, waiting, patient the way old men in villages are patient, with a patience that is not passive but is actually a form of attention so complete that nothing escapes it. "She worked for me," Richard said finally, "in my house, in Asaba. He stopped. He swallowed. "I need her help." The old man's expression did not change. "You are the one who hit her," he said. The words landed like a physical blow. Richard felt them in his chest, in his stomach, in the place behind his eyes where shame lives when it has nowhere else to go. "Yes," he said. The old man nodded slowly, not a nod of approval, not a nod of condemnation, a nod of confirmation, the nod of a man who is simply noting that the world is behaving exactly as he expected it to. "She came back last night," the old man said. "She walked the whole way. She arrived after dark. Her feet were bleeding." Richard closed his eyes. "She is at her sister's house," the old man said. "Last house on the left, past the well." Richard opened his eyes. "Thank you." He began to walk. The old man's voice stopped him. "Young man." Richard turned. "She has been talking about your daughter since she arrived. Not about you. Not about what you did. About the child." The old man paused. "Whatever you came here to say, remember that. She is not thinking about herself. She is thinking about your child. That is who she is." Richard stood there for a moment. Then he nodded. Then he walked toward the last house on the left, past the well. The house was small. Mud walls, zinc roof, a single window with a curtain made from a piece of cloth that had once been blue and was now the color of something that has been washed by rain and sun until it has forgotten what color it used to be. There was a wooden bench outside the door. A small garden beside the house where somebody had planted tomatoes and peppers and something tall and green that Richard did not recognize. He stood outside the house. He could hear voices inside. Low voices. The murmur of women talking in a way that women talk when one of them is hurting and the other is holding the hurt with her, not trying to fix it, just holding it. Richard raised his hand to knock. And then he stopped. Because his hand, his right hand, the hand he was about to knock with, was the same hand that had struck her face yesterday morning. The same hand. He looked at it. He looked at his knuckles, at the lines of his palm, at the hand of a man who built an empire with these fingers and used them to slap an old woman who had done nothing but try to help him. He knocked with his left hand. The voices inside went quiet. Footsteps. The curtain in the window moved. Then the door opened. The woman who opened it was younger than Mama Ngozi. Maybe 50. She had the same broad build, the same wide hands, the same steady eyes. She looked at Richard and her face hardened immediately. Not with anger, with something more measured. The face of a woman who is placing herself between her sister and the thing that hurt her. "You are not welcome here," she said. Her voice was calm, but it was final. "I know," Richard said. "Then why are you standing at my door?" "Because my daughter is in the hospital," Richard said. "And she is dying. And the only person who can help her is your sister." The woman stared at him. Behind her, from somewhere inside the house, there was a sound. Movement. The shuffle of feet. And then Mama Ngozi appeared in the doorway behind her sister. Richard saw her face and everything inside him went very still. The bruise had darkened overnight. It covered her left cheek, purple and swollen, spreading toward her eye. Her lip was cut where his hand had caught the corner of her mouth. She looked older than she had looked yesterday, not because a day had passed but because something in her had changed. The way a person looks when a thing they had been carrying for a long time has finally been set down and the setting down has left them smaller, lighter, and somehow more fragile than the carrying did. She looked at Richard. She did not speak. Richard looked at her, at the bruise, at the evidence of what he had done, sitting there on her face like a signature. Undeniable, permanent in a way that went deeper than skin. "Mama Ngozi," he said, and his voice broke on her name, just cracked open like dry earth in the first rain. Not dramatically, not loudly, just a small break, a fissure that let something through that he had been holding back since yesterday morning, since last night, since the moment he looked around his daughter's bedroom for the person who was always there and found only absence. "Chidinma stopped breathing last night," he said. "The medications are holding her, but the doctors—" He stopped. He pressed his hand, his left hand, over his eyes. He stood there for a moment with his hand over his face and his shoulders tight and the morning sun falling on his back and the chickens clucking somewhere behind him and the sound of children playing near the tree. Then he lowered his hand. His eyes were wet. He did not wipe them. He did not try to compose himself. For the first time in as long as he could remember, he did not try to be anything other than what he was. A frightened father. A broken man. A person who had done a terrible thing and was standing in the aftermath of it asking for something he had no right to ask for. "I came to beg you," he said. "I came to beg. I don't know how to beg. I have never done it. I don't know the words. But my daughter is in a hospital bed and her breathing is wrong and the machines are doing what they can, but they can't reach her the way you reach her. Nobody can. Nobody ever could." He stopped. He breathed. He looked at Mama Ngozi directly. "I slapped you. I slapped you in your face and I threw you out of your home because that house was your home. It was more your home than it was mine. You made it a home. You made it alive. And I hit you and I sent you away and I called you a kitchen assistant and I treated you like you were nothing and you are not nothing. You are the reason my daughter is alive. You have been the reason she is alive for 6 years and I was too blind and too proud and too stupid to see it." His voice was shaking now, not with the controlled tremor of a man performing emotion, with the uncontrolled, ungovernable shaking of a man who has lost his grip on the thing he always held tightest. Himself. "I am not asking you to forgive me. I don't deserve that. I am asking you to save my daughter. Because she is asking for you." She opened her eyes in that hospital bed and the first thing she said, the only thing she said, was your name. The clearing was quiet. The old man on the bench was watching from across the way. The children had stopped playing. Even the chickens seemed to have paused. Mama Ngozi stood in the doorway of her sister's house. The bruise was dark on her face. Her eyes were steady. She looked at Richard with an expression that he was only now, after everything, beginning to understand. It was the same expression she had always had when she looked at him. The same one she had worn in his study yesterday morning before his hand moved. The same one she had worn every time she knelt beside his daughter's bed at 3 o'clock in the morning. It was not anger. It was not forgiveness. It was not judgment. It was knowing. The deep, old, unhurried knowing of a woman who had seen enough of life to understand that people are not one thing. That the hand that strikes and the hand that shakes with fear for a child's life can be the same hand. That cruelty and love can live in the same person, and that what matters, what has always mattered, is which one you feed. She looked at him for a long time. Then she turned to her sister. She said something in the language of their village, quiet words that Richard did not understand. Her sister looked at Richard, then back at Mama Ngozi. Then she nodded slowly, the way people nod when they disagree with a decision but love the person making it too much to stand in their way. Mama Ngozi stepped back inside the house. She was gone for less than 2 minutes. When she came back, she had her bag, the same few possessions. And in her hand, held carefully the way you hold a thing that is precious and irreplaceable, was the small tin. She walked past her sister. She walked past Richard. She walked toward the path that led to the road where his car was parked. She did not say a word. Richard stood there for a moment. Then he followed her. They walked the narrow path back through the bush in silence. Mama Ngozi walked ahead. Richard walked behind. The red earth of the path was the same earth that had stained his shoes on the way in, but it felt different now. Everything felt different. The bush pressing in on both sides. The sound of insects. The heat building in the morning air. He was walking through the same landscape, but he was not the same man who had walked through it 20 minutes ago. They reached the car. Richard opened the passenger door for her. She looked at the open door for a moment. Then she got in. Richard got in the driver's side. He started the engine. And then, before he put the car in gear, before they began the drive back to the hospital, Mama Ngozi spoke. The first words she had said to him since he arrived at her village. "How is her color?" she asked. Not "how could you?" Not "I trusted you." Not "you hit me and threw me away after I gave your family 6 years of my life." Not any of the things she had every right to say. Not any of the things that any other person on earth would have said. How is her color? Because that was who she was. That was who she had always been. A woman whose first thought, whose only thought, whose entire being was organized around the well-being of a child who was not her own by blood but was her own by every measure that actually mattered. Richard gripped the steering wheel. "Pale," he said. "She was pale when I left." Mama Ngozi nodded. She opened her bag. She took out the tin. She opened it. She looked at the paste inside, dark and thick and earthy, and she pressed the lid back on carefully. "Drive," she said. "Fast." Richard drove. The drive back to the hospital took just over 2 hours. They did not speak much. The road unspooled in front of them, laterite to tarmac, village to town to city, the landscape running backward like a film being rewound. And in the silence between them, in the space where words should have been, was something that Richard did not have a name for yet. Not forgiveness, not trust, something more preliminary than either. A door that had been opened just enough for air to move through it. Just enough for breathing. They arrived at the hospital at 11 o'clock in the morning. Richard parked. He got out. Mama Ngozi got out. She stood in the hospital car park for a moment, small and broad in her wrapper and her blouse with her bag over one shoulder and the tin in her hand, and she looked up at the building. She did not look like a woman who belonged in a hospital. She looked like a woman who belonged in a kitchen, in a garden, in a clearing beside a well. She looked like exactly what Richard had always told himself she was. A kitchen assistant. A simple woman from a small village. And she was about to walk into that hospital and do what every doctor and every machine and every protocol inside it had not been able to do. Richard led her through the entrance, past the triage desk, past the corridors full of people and worry and the fluorescent lights that turned every face the same shade of exhaustion, to the pediatric ward, to the treatment bay where Chidinma lay. Amara was beside the bed. She looked up when Richard walked in. Her eyes moved to Mama Ngozi and something happened on her face that Richard would remember. Relief. Pure, overwhelming physical relief. The kind that makes your shoulders drop and your breath change and your eyes fill with water because you have been holding something alone for too long and someone has finally come to help you carry it. Her oxygen has been between 83 and 86 all night, Amara said. She's stable, but she's not improving. The doctor did rounds an hour ago. She wants to discuss next steps this afternoon. Mama Ngozi did not respond to Amara. She did not look at the monitors. She did not read the chart. She walked straight to the bed. She put her bag down on the floor. She leaned over and she looked at Chidinma's face. The child was sleeping. The oxygen mask covered her nose and mouth. Her skin was pale, an ashy pallor that did not belong on a child's face. Her breathing was shallow and audible, each inhale accompanied by that thin, tight sound that Mama Ngozi had heard so many times in the dark of Chidinma's bedroom at home. Mama Ngozi placed one hand on Chidinma's forehead. She held it there. She closed her eyes. And she stood like that for nearly a full minute, not moving, not speaking, just feeling. Reading the child's body the way a person reads a language they have spoken their entire life. The way her mother had taught her. The way her grandmother had taught her mother. The way knowledge moves between women in places where books are rare and the body is the only text. She opened her eyes. She opened the tin. Warm water, she said to Amara. A small cloth. And I need the room quiet. No beeping if you can silence it. No talking. Just quiet. Amara looked at Richard. Richard nodded. Amara adjusted the monitor to silent mode. She brought warm water and a cloth. She stepped back. And Mama Ngozi began. She warmed the paste between her palms. She opened Chidinma's hospital gown. She placed her hands on the child's chest, those wide, rough, certain hands, and she began to rub, slowly, firmly, in circles that followed a pattern only she could see. And as she rubbed, she began to hum. That sound, that low, steady, ancient sound that was not a melody but was something deeper than melody. Something that vibrated in the chest. Something that felt like the earth itself was humming through this woman's throat, through her hands, into the body of a child who was fighting for every breath. Chidinma's face changed. Not immediately, not dramatically, but Richard saw it. The tension around her eyes softened. The line between her brows, that small line that no 6-year-old should have, smoothed. Her fingers, which had been curled tight against the sheet, loosened. Mama Ngozi kept working. Her hands moved in their slow circles. Her humming filled the room, and the room itself seemed to change. The fluorescent light seemed softer. The hospital sounds seemed further away. The space around the bed became a different kind of space. Not clinical, not managed, sacred. The kind of space that forms when someone who knows what they are doing gives everything they have to the act of healing. 3 minutes. 5 minutes. 7. Amara was watching the portable monitor she held in her hand. Her eyes were wide. 88, she whispered. Mama Ngozi did not look up. She kept humming. She kept rubbing. 91. Richard pressed his back against the wall. His legs were not steady. 94. Chidinma's breathing was changing. The thin, tight sound was fading. Each breath was coming deeper, fuller, easier. The terrible effort, the whole body labor that had been visible in every inhale, was easing. The child's body was letting go of something it had been gripping for hours. Letting go of fear, letting go of fight, settling into something that looked, finally, like rest. 97. Amara looked at Richard. Tears were running down her face. She was not wiping them. She was just standing there holding the monitor and watching a woman with a tin of homemade paste do what an entire hospital had not been able to do. Mama Ngozi stopped humming. She placed one hand flat on Chidinma's chest. She held it there. She closed her eyes again. And then Chidinma opened hers. She looked up at the face above her. The face that had been above her in the dark of her bedroom for 6 years. The face that she had asked for in the night. The face that meant safe and warm and home and the sound that makes the bad breathing stop. Mama Ngozi, she said. Her voice was small and rough and beautiful. Her hand came up from the sheet and found Mama Ngozi's hand on her chest, and her small fingers wrapped around one thick finger and held on. I'm here, NWAM, Mama Ngozi said. I'm here. I came back. Chidinma smiled. A small, tired, 6-year-old smile. The smile of a child who has gotten the only thing she wanted. I knew you would, she said. And then she closed her eyes and she slept. And the monitors held steady, and the breathing held steady, and the room held steady, and Mama Ngozi stood beside the bed with her hand on the child's chest and did not move. Richard Obiora slid down the wall. He sat on the floor of that hospital room. A man in a wrinkled suit and dirty shoes sitting on a hospital floor with his knees up and his hands on his face and his shoulders shaking. He cried. Not the way powerful men are supposed to cry. Not briefly, not discreetly, not behind a closed door. He cried the way a person cries when the wall they have been building for 20 years comes down all at once. Loudly, messily, with sounds that came from a place so deep inside him that he did not recognize them as his own. He cried for his daughter. He cried for Mama Ngozi. He cried for the bruise on her face that he had put there. He cried for 6 years of blindness and pride and the terrible, specific cruelty of treating a healer like a servant. He cried for his mother Eunice, who had stood at a junction every morning and known every person's name. He cried for the version of himself that she would not recognize. The version that Mama Ngozi had described in his study yesterday morning, with words so true that the truth of them had made him violent. Your mother would not recognize the man you have become. She was right. She was right, and he had hit her for being right, and his daughter had almost died because of it, and Mama Ngozi had walked back through the bush with bleeding feet and come to this hospital and saved his child anyway. Anyway, that word. That impossible, unbearable, grace-filled word. She saved his child anyway. Chidinma recovered. Fully. Completely. The way children recover when the right hands find them in time. Richard brought Mama Ngozi home. Not as a kitchen assistant. As family. He built her a house on the compound, beside the garden, where the morning light came in warm and early. He never raised his hand again. He learned to kneel, to listen, to say thank you with actions that outlasted words. And every evening, Mama Ngozi sat with Chidinma under the stars and told her stories about the tortoise, the spider, and the girl who could talk to rivers. Thank you for sitting with this story all the way to the end. If it moved you, I think you'll find a home in the other videos on your screen right now. And if you haven't subscribed yet, come join us. There's always a place by the fire at Village Heart. Until next time.